Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope this somewhat late recording is not too disconcerting for you all. I want to keep this as short as possible, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon in class. Today I want to talk about information. We begin with three words bound together in 2 lines of poetry. Where's the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? What is the relationship between these three things? Wisdom, knowledge, information. A wise sage, a knowledgeable scholar. A book or an image rich in information. We're going to discuss these questions, these relationships, in class. But already we can note, and you may already be thinking this, that these terms appear in the works of different kinds of thinkers. For instance, the Buddha spoke extensively about wisdom. Philosophers talk a lot about the nature of knowledge. While information is analyzed by physicists, neuroscientists, ecologists, economists, electrical engineers, among many, many others. Our first story today is about how information became something. We can start at the beginning. At first, of course, there was nothing. No space, no time, no matter, no energy. Just nothing. And then suddenly, of course, there was everything. Space, expanding frantically in all direction. Time, dividing the past from the future. Energy, of course, strange matter everywhere, writhing and appearing and disappearing and reappearing in the event that we now call the Big Bang. And in addition to matter and energy, was there also maybe information? The book of John says, "En arche en hologos," in the beginning was the Word. Was the Word there at the beginning? Was information a feature of the universe? Can we say coherently that galaxies emit information? That dinosaur brains process data? Or on the other hand, is information a category of human experience? Did we make information when we built systems of knowledge? So what I'm asking is information given to us in nature, or is it something that we create? As historians, how might we even begin to answer this question? Let's start with 2 different views on this matter. Let's look at these 2 quotes. In the beginning there was information. The Word came later. And information is, after all, a word with a history. It is a cultural invention that has come to prominence at a certain point in time in a specific constellation of interests. Once that history is grasped, information clearly shows itself, contra Dretske, here's Dretske, not to be a fit successor to the Word. So, first thing we might notice here is that we're not the only ones who kind of think cosmically when we start talking about information. It seems to flow towards the cosmic scale, no matter who's talking, and I want to talk about that with you when we meet in class. And also, as is often the case with cosmic conversations, a lot seems to be at stake here. We see here 2 very different ways of thinking about what history is, right? So we take the first quote, which is from the philosopher Fred Dretske's book, Knowledge and the Flow of Information. For Dretske, information is a feature of the universe itself. It's a physical attribute of objects and systems. Information, according to Dretske, has always been around. So as historians, we can, if that's what we believe about what information is, we could do things like identify information flows in the past and analyze them in the same way that we can talk about information in the present day. The second quote comes from a historian with a very different point of view. That person, John Peters, comes from a tradition that is sometimes in French called l'histoire des mentalités, the history of mentalities or of ways of thinking. For Peters, information is an idea, not a physical quality. And it's an idea that wandered around for a long time before it settled into the meaning it has today. So from Peters' perspective, it's wrong-headed to talk about information in the distant past, say, to talk about information in the Big Bang. The word information, as we use it, only makes sense in our specific historical context. Let's explore that a little bit. The word information entered the English language in the 14th century from a Latin root informare, a verb. And for a long time, that word in English meant something like forming, right? We see this in the first quote here on the left side. There was a seminality, that's a weird word, which means like a quickening, an insemination. There was a seminality and contracted atom in the rib, which by the information of a soul was individuated into Eve. This is an account of how Eve became a person. This is this story from Genesis, which you may or may not be familiar with, in which Adam was formed first, and then Eve is formed out of a rib that God removes from the side of Adam's body. So this God takes the rib and informs it with a soul. So he infuses it. He takes the raw matter and he shapes it into a new form, into a living being. So inform is to apply a form to a thing. We start to come closer to our contemporary understanding of information, a little bit closer, when we think about the information of thoughts. Ideas are informed in the human mind. And so, in this sense, information starts mostly as a verb, as an active transformation of the world. But slowly, over the course of the 18th and 19th century, information leaves the body and the mind and becomes abstracted. It becomes a quantity which is carried from afar, from one mind to another. It's something that can be recorded in government documents, that can be tallied up in tables. And finally, in the 20th century, it becomes a physical quantity. Where does this happen? It happens in the telephone business, where the question of how much information is passing over these lines is a matter of pure economics. And that's what we see on the other side. Oops, it looks like there's a little bit of an error with my citation. A quantitative measure of information, which is based on physical, it's contrasted with psychological considerations, is demonstrated. I'm missing a piece of it. How the rate of transmission of this information over a system is limited by the distortion resulting from storage of energy is discussed from this viewpoint. So this is a quote from a 1928 paper by an electrical engineer named Hartley, who was working at Bell Laboratories, that is to say, at the research lab associated with the American telephone company AT&T. You don't need to remember these details, and we'll go over some of them again before the course is finished. So far, really, you should be remembering two things. The first is that when we ask the question, what is information, there are at least two ways to answer the question. two broad frameworks that we can use to answer the question. In the first, we answer, information is an eternal physical quantity. And in the second, we answer, information is a historically specific idea. You are going to have to decide how to choose between these two viewpoints and whether maybe you can mix and match. Maybe you can find a middle ground between these two viewpoints or find them in some way compatible. And the second thing that you need to remember is that in the second framework, in this sort of historicist framework, there is a remarkable and distinct shift in the meaning of the word information in English, but also in other European languages, over the course of about 600 years, from 1400 to 2000. And that shift moves information from an almost spiritual, cosmic notion that touches on the nature of God and the nature of thought to a much more prosaic, that is to say, a much more ordinary, down-to-earth idea, a concrete idea, a discrete idea of a quantity that can be used in the course of doing business. And this shift happens along with many other historical changes, some of which we discussed last time when we talked about revolutions, and some of which we'll talk more about during the semester. So those are our two kind of points. These two distinct ways of viewing it, and in the second way of viewing it, a shift from sort of spiritual to concrete. And this brings us finally towards our goal, which is to understand the context of the cyber sciences, of the study of information. There are lots of places where we could have begun this story. We could have gone back to talk about some philosophical ideas from the ancient Greeks. That's sort of easy. We could talk about technological developments in the 19th century, especially around the development of the steam engine, the most important technology of the early Industrial Revolution, and something, a particular invention called the governor that made it possible to use very high pressures in steam engines. But most of the time, when we talk about cybernetics or about information, the easiest place to start is World War II. World War II, of course, was special in lots of ways, had a tremendous impact on history at a global scale, across the world, in the North, in the South, in the East, and the West. But I would invite you to think about it in this very brief lecture, particularly in terms of science and technology. Technological innovation has always been a part of warfare, and if you are interested in this kind of stuff, you probably already know the stirrup, the longbow, the rifle, the machine gun. Each of those played a decisive role in battles of the past. But in World War II, something pretty new happened. And that was that the full power of modern science, a kind of scientific activity that hadn't really existed in the past ever before, that full power of science was harnessed to the war machine in utterly new ways. For instance, whole new bureaucracies of science were established in a way that absolutely didn't exist before the mid-20th century. Scientists took jobs in the military. All of the combatant nations did this. The Americans, the British, the Germans, the Soviets, and even the Italians. This was, at the time, recognized as a total war, a war in which the whole society was mobilized as part of the war effort. It wasn't just a war of weapons, it was a war of economies, and even civilian life was heavily militarized. Again, that was true no matter which side of the war you were on. And that went for businesses of all kind, For instance, it went for the telephone company, where Hartley, who wrote that second quote from the last slide, had lived. Still, among all these efforts, one stands out particularly. Usually, when we think about science and technology, we think about the atomic bomb, and we should. It had absolutely devastating consequences. We see here the late-stage mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And it had this spectacular quality and came right at the very, very end of a very long conflict. And so in our memory of science and the war, the atomic bomb stands out as very special. And of course it's structured, thermonuclear destruction structured the whole Cold War period and may come back to haunt us very soon. And when we think of it that way, it brings power and knowledge and bureaucratic organization together in the pursuit of an absolute and total destructiveness. This is an important perspective, but it distorts the overall importance of science and technology in the war. Because while the Manhattan Project was a huge enterprise, very expensive and extremely labor intensive, there were other big science projects that probably had overall a bigger effect on the outcome of the war. Probably way more important for the triumph of the Allies in World War II was radar, the technology that allows planes to see in darkness, and that allows anti-aircraft gun emplacements to locate enemy aircraft in the sky above them. So radar was actively used for years during the war, whereas the atomic bomb was really only used at the very end of a war, which had basically already been won before it was dropped. And radar was developed mostly, not only, but mostly at in a place called the Radiation Laboratory at MIT. Something else that happened in the Rad Lab was the development of cybernetics. Cybernetics is one of two sources of the mathematical theory of information. Not shown here is a brilliant young communications engineer working at Bell Labs named Claude Shannon, who was one person to come up with the theory of information. The other kind of father of information theory is Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener was a kind of portly full professor of mathematics at MIT during World War II. And we can just talk very briefly about who he was. His father, Leo Wiener, was a professor of Slavic literature at Harvard University, and Norbert was raised as a child prodigy. He received his undergraduate degree in mathematics at the age of 14, went on to study philosophy and zoology before returning to theoretical math for his PhD at Harvard at the age of 19. He went on to become a famously stereotypical, absent-minded professor at MIT. There were stories about him not being able to recognize his own family when he would encounter them, in the middle of town. Supposedly, he failed to remember that his family had moved, went back to his house one day, was surprised to find it empty, things like that. He was a very successful mathematician, made a bunch of important kind of discoveries, maybe the wrong word, proved a bunch of important theorems in the 1920s. And during World War II, he studied with all the most famous mathematicians of his day in Germany and elsewhere. But during World War II, he was he was employed at the RAD lab, the radiation laboratory that I talked about just a moment ago. He turned out to be very annoying to work with, and the administrators of the RAD lab looked around and found a project for Wiener to work on his own, and that was the automation of anti-aircraft guns. And he went on to try to develop a technology that he called the anti-aircraft predictor. Now, this turned out to be kind of an interesting area of work, and I won't go into the technical details. Wiener talks about them a lot in my bibliography. There's a pretty great source that also discusses it. What matters most for our story is that there's an interaction between the anti-aircraft gun and the movement of the aircraft that makes aiming a weapon very, very difficult. Wiener's big idea is, look, we think of the gun and the airplane as two separate things. That's a natural sort of prejudice that we have. But from another perspective, they're actually part of the same system. And inside that system, each component, the gun and the aircraft, or we might say the gunner and the aircraft pilot, each of them is getting a signal from the other component of the system. And they're using that signal to alter their behavior. And the signal is, how close is the explosive shell to the plane? And in particular, Wiener said, the gun is using negative feedback. That is, it is trying to reduce the difference between the position of the plane and the position of the explosive shell. And when that distance is reduced to 0, then blam! The gun has achieved its purpose. And this led Wiener to a whole bunch of complex thoughts, many of which are mentioned in the short reading that you did this week. His first thought was, okay, this machine is acting with purpose, the machine that he was building, which tried to predict this and manage this feedback relationship. And he said, we ought to just say that, we ought to just say it straight out, right? Humans are purposeful, animals are purposeful, and machines are purposeful. And this purpose can be described from an engineering and from a mathematical perspective as what is now well known as a feedback loop, where the system regulates itself. The anti-aircraft predictor that he was trying to build was a self-regulating machine. A thermostat is a self-regulating machine. A mouse is a self-regulating machine, and a human is also a self-regulating machine. So that's his first thought. All of these different kinds of things are united. They're all purposeful mechanisms. His second thought was, this self-regulation takes place through an exchange of signals. And we can describe this exchange of signals mathematically. And he explores that and comes up with the equation that you see above. His third thought is, that quantity is the negative of something called entropy in physics. And entropy is a really, really important concept in physics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's complicated, but one way to think about it is as a measure of disorder in a system. The more entropy there is, the more disordered the system is. And the entropy of a system tends to increase over time. That's why your room is always getting messier day by day. And in fact, entropy defines the direction of time. The whole universe is getting more and more distorted over time. That's 3. So what's the next thought? Information, then, is the opposite of entropy. It's the opposite of disorder. It's a principle of order that struggles to sustain itself. You know what else is like that? Life itself is like that. Life swims against the tide of destruction. To be alive is to struggle to survive and to grow long enough to build some small amount of order in the world before entropy finally overtakes you and you die. That is, Information is the principle of life itself, and it explains almost everything that we care about. And so, in the way that Wiener thinks about things, information is this overarching mathematical concept, but also it's an overarching physical quantity that explains huge swaths of phenomena, huge numbers of things in our experience. And that unites animals and machines and also defines what is so special about life. And especially, it defines what is so special about human life. This has two implications for us. The first is that it is a hugely successful concept in the 1950s and 1960s. Both cybernetics and information science become immensely popular in the 1950s and 1960s. And while cybernetics doesn't really survive as a discipline, it reaches out into all kinds of disciplines. It has effects in anthropology, economics, sociology, ecology, neuroscience, computer science, and electrical engineering, of course. So that's one thing that we should think about. And the other is that the connections between all these diverse topics led Wiener to believe that it was possible to devise a kind of scientific morality that was rooted in the simple mathematical truths that he thought he had uncovered. And we can see this as we get towards the end of the chapter that you read for this class. The best we can hope, he said, for the role of progress in a universe running downhill as a whole is that the vision of our attempts to progress in the face of overwhelming necessity may have the purging terror of Greek tragedy. So here's the vision. The vision is that as a whole the universe is running down. Entropy is increasing. Disorder is increasing. And yet, it is possible for brief moments in geological or cosmic time to struggle against that entropic process, to build, at least for a moment. And while we are doomed to destruction in the long run, in the short run, in the medium run, we have the capacity to grow and live and thrive. And so we see this kind of interesting arc to the concept of information. It begins as a spiritual cosmic idea. It becomes prosaic and ordinary. But then it becomes spiritual and cosmic again. In what, the German idealists might have called a dialectical process through engaging with its own implications. As you engage with this text, I think you will find it often a little bit difficult. And that is okay. What I want to do in class is read through a couple of short sections and think about how we come to an understanding of texts of this nature. All right. I've gone on much longer than I wanted to. I look forward to seeing you soon. I hope you have a good night.